As we already said, we want to talk today a little bit about the different effects on men and women that came out of the whole corona situation. And various studies actually showed that this crisis has far-reaching consequences when it comes to gender diversity and gender disparity as well. So I think there is a careful consideration needed in terms of what are the challenges, but maybe also what are the opportunities that came out of it. So we don't just want to see the negative sides, but we definitely also want to see the other side of the medal. So I want then also go into the responsibilities of the different players in the market, definitely our leaders in the companies, in the different organizations, but also the people that are affected. And you will see there are a lot of women affected, and I think there's also a certain responsibility there. So I think gender diversity and inclusion is more important than ever, and that's why I'm looking forward to sharing my slides with you. And let me see, I have here. Okay, there we go. So when we look at the many different aspects around the topic, you probably have seen many different statements in the news, on social media about exposing inequality. And I've just brought you here many different headlines of different media publications since March, actually. So what is interesting to see is that actually in the past, usually in crisis, women were actually suffering more. And that's very an interesting aspect, because this makes COVID-19 just the latest in a long line of epidemics that have brought economic inequalities to the front line, and especially considering gender. So when we look basically at the Zika and Ebola outbreaks on men and women, also there we saw some consequences in terms of gender disparity. For instance, there was a study done about the Ebola epidemic in Sierra Leone, and there you saw a dramatic increase in maternity mortality. And not only that, but especially in a situation of outbreaks, especially in previous outbreaks, we saw that in terms of resources, everything goes to the outbreak. And usually that means that the routine services are disrupted or heavily affected. And especially in poor countries, that means that the first thing that actually goes down is the maternal health services. So it shows a little bit of a bleak image here for both genders, actually, because also for men, we will see that the effect had been dramatically, because studies also show that the immediate risk of death from the disease of COVID-19 had actually a much greater concern than expected. So this just to give you a short kind of intro into the topic, where we stand in terms of gender and gender disparity and equality in terms of the disease. So when we talk about the different impact, I just want to highlight two aspects here. First, obviously, when we talk about women, and the other one about men. And I also want to make clear that in my talk today, obviously, I focus on the topic of gender diversity. However, we cannot forget that there are many different levels of diversity, which I do not talk today. However, they're not less important. So this is very important for me. Also, on the other hand, I will talk a lot about men and women. This does not mean that I want to stereotype too much, but I just want to show you certain extremes. And I also don't want to forget that, there are many different people that actually do not consider themselves, in this binary way of thinking. And I don't want to exclude them at all. But with my talk, the focus was on gender diversity, and therefore I just want to make sure that you do not think that I don't want to leave the other ones excluded. So this was very important for me because I think gender stereotyping can have a bad effect. But in the talk today, we want to see the extremes and then in the end kind of make the conclusions out of that. So basically, when we talk about women, what we saw from studies since March is that they were heavily affected in terms of economical aspects. And why is that so? Because nearly 60% of women around the world work in the so-called informal economy. So they're earning less, they usually have less savings, and they usually are at greater risk of falling into poverty. So when we look at the impact since March, more women lost their paid jobs, and I will go into that deeper in one of my next slides. So this is one aspect that definitely affected women more than men. But on the other hand, there are also gender differences in the course of the disease. Men, for instance, were hospitalized more often than women, and also far longer in intensive care units. So just two aspects here that we want to go into more deeply later on. But what is also interesting is that especially because of those different gender disparities, we see that out of that development, we can maybe draw some opportunities for the developments to come. And so one of the first aspects that I would like to concentrate on is some of the questions around what is happening with the roles at home. Because this has a huge impact and also on the economical situation of families, men and women. And so what we saw, for instance, is that a lot of women took care of the homeschooling when the kids were home, when the schools were closed during lockdown. But why is that so? And so this then brings out the question, are we actually going back into more outdated and conservative role models here in Switzerland, for instance, but also all over Europe? And actually we see that all over the world that we could learn from studies. And then especially here in Switzerland, we see more often than not that kids are cared for by grandparents. But during the lockdown, we saw that grandparents were not available because they belong to the risk group. And so the daycares were closed, the grandparents were not available. What does that mean to the whole family model? And also there we saw some huge effects on women. So one thing that we definitely saw is that the role allocation in the corona crisis needs to be examined because the existing gender inequalities, they actually increased. And so this is a topic that needs to have more research. I hope that we can do more studies around that. And then also in the long run, what does it mean for long-term developments? But then also women are disproportionately burdened more in the progress of the division of gainful employment and unpaid work, at least on a temporary basis. But we do see they also have long-term effects. And here I can maybe give you also an example from the very, very early time in crisis. And we saw that in Japan. It was very funny, the notion how they actually framed that, because in Japan, they very early on said, okay, we all have to go into home office because home office is important. But the reasoning out of it, they said home office is important so that women can take care of children. So again, there is this conservative thinking of home office is important only for women because they take care of children. So just to give you this, it's just one word that is missing because they could just say home office is important so that parents can take care of children. But that we saw that as well here in Switzerland. Another development that we saw from studies made since March is that more women actually reduced their working hours, their paid working hours, because the schools and daycares were closed, more women than men. And this also means not only that they actually reduced the working hours, but that also means that it had a huge impact on their opportunities to get promoted, on their opportunities to actually gain more money, to step into a more senior role. And so with this feminization of responsibility in home office, there's actually a huge threat in there for the achievements that women had in the past years. And so this effect of the school closures didn't just have an impact on the pupils, basically, but also definitely on the situation of women in the labor market. And we see that also in our courses, for instance, we have a course called Women Back to Business. And what we heard a lot, that a lot of women actually pulled back. They didn't start the course. And the reasoning was that first, the husbands had to make sure that they can keep their jobs, so the women have to step back. So it's always this notion the women have to step back because the men have to look first. And why is that so? Because of course, financial considerations play a major role here. But you know, that's a very short-term perspective, because in the long term, again, when women step back, they earn less, they pay less into their retirement funds. So in the long term, they miss their retirement funds is decreasing, and that's actually not good for the whole society and the economy. And so the mothers, they just had less capacity for their job, you know. So they thought, well, our husbands, they earn more, so they have, you know, they can go first, so we step back. Or all the single parents, for instance, as well. And then also we had some notions heard that some women think that they can do it better than the men. So that's why they have to step back in their paid jobs to take care of the family duties. So this re-traditionalization, I want to call it, brings very clearly again that image of the father as a breadwinner of the family. And so we go back, we return to traditional roles. And usually because of that short-term view of the financial resources. But again, this is a huge risk. On the other hand, is this not only a risk, but it could maybe be an opportunity, because the role of companies and organizations are very important here, because they also have some sort of responsibility when it comes to how do we divide the work, you know. It's not okay to expect from fathers to be in a call all day long because they think that the mothers take care of children. But then for the women, it's okay to miss a call. So there also the companies and organizations have a responsibility. And what we saw, for instance, some of the organizations, also the University of St. Gallen, they made a huge step in terms of seeing that as an opportunity and also support families, especially mothers. So the time at home with the children, it was counted as working hours. So nobody had to take vacation for that during the lockdown. And I know that other organizations did the same. And I think it's very important to actually bring that to the front line, to see that we can actually use that as an opportunity and support the families and especially working mothers. So, but again, it always comes down to the question, so whose job is more important? And we do see as a risk, when I summarize, in crisis, usually the one actually cut backs who does it anyway, who did it, you know, in the past few years. And unfortunately, especially in our country, usually those are the women and the mothers. And currently it does feel like a step back. But then there's also chances, because the daily care work, you know, became very visible, especially for fathers. They all of a sudden realized, oh my God, you know, it's amazing what my partner is doing at home. And we do also see from studies in Germany that this was the situation. The pandemic had also an effect that it could be positive in the long term, because it has been shown that teleworking, remote working, home office is also feasible for many, many more professional activities than we thought. And it can be an option for men and women, and especially men and fathers. They have been enabled to spend more time at home, and they realized they like it. And it can be a test site, or I mean, the whole situation, the lockdown was a test site for a new division of labor at home. So maybe we have to turn the medal around and see it as a chance, but then also, you know, take this responsibility and talk to our partners, talk to our employers in order to make this development sustainable into the positive direction. So in the study that was made in Germany, it was also shown that there is a positive development because men are catching up in care work. And in percentage terms, the men have been considerably increased their commitment, you know, at home. And that's something that I see we have to actually support, maybe with policies, maybe with support from the companies, so that we do not let it drop, because we have to use the momentum here. The second point that I want to discuss is what are disease differences in terms of gender? And I just touched upon shortly in the beginning, because more men were initially affected by COVID-19 than women. And actually also more men died from the disease all over the world, actually. So we want to look into that a little bit deeper, and I brought you here two charts. So the left one is from Switzerland, so the share of women of total confirmed COVID-19 infections. And that's actually very interesting, because in the beginning, the men were the ones that were infected first and far more. But then after the lockdown, there was an exponential increase as well by the women. And that has the reason because more women work in caregiving facilities, they work in schools, they're far more exposed to the disease than men. And so there was a study made in the US actually, and so then one of the most striking differences that has emerged so far is in the death rates of men and women. So there were twice as many men that have been dying from the virus as women. And this similar pattern we can also see in Western Europe. We also see it actually in China. But the reasoning behind that effect is still quite unclear. I mean, scientists, they try to shed some light into the dark. And so some researchers are looking into the reasons for this disparity. And for instance, one point is that they include the different immune system between men and women. So they say maybe hormones play an effect here. The immune system of women usually react differently. And also in the past, studies have shown that women's immune system often reacts stronger and faster. So that could be one reason. But then also another very important thought is around smoking, because there's a higher rate of smoking among men. And so maybe smoking could also be a driver of this disease. That's why maybe more men show a positive testing results, and also because the death rate is higher. And then, you know, some very, very stereotypical explanations here. For instance, about hygiene. There were studies that wanted to show that women care more about themselves. I mean, it could be, but again, from my side, it's can also be biased, so we have to be careful with those stereotypes. And then also another one, definitely, that men actually go less to the doctor, and that's why they actually miss certain important timings when the symptoms arise, and then eventually they become more seriously ill. So it's interesting to see that also in the past, for instance, in 2003 and 2012, when other coronaviruses broke, we saw that more men were affected actually. And so that's quite interesting. And so maybe together with studies from this year, this could shed some light into this still kind of a dark tunnel, because I think that would be very interesting, especially because I think in terms of gender medicine, we hear a lot that a lot of the data actually are based on male, situations and male symptoms and so on. And so there's a huge push into more equality in terms of gender medicine, especially for women. One topic, for instance, and one example are heart attacks. The symptoms for men are completely different than the symptoms for women. But I think here, in terms of the COVID-19 situation, we cannot forget the fact that obviously men had been affected differently than women. So I think also here, this can not only be a risk, but also an opportunity in terms of gender medicine to look into the fact that, men and women react differently to certain diseases, to certain health issues. And so I just hope that this can bring a topic to the surface, that more studies and research will be done around that. And as I said, after the lockdown, more women than men became infected because they were really exposed due to healthcare workforce involvement, and also due to childcare work in schools. And so this is something that we have to divide. Do men and women become infected more because of kind of the health issues, because of the reaction of the disease, or because of the exposure in a certain industry and workforce? The third point, which brings me actually also to the effects of the on an economical side, when we talk about home office and part-time, what does that mean for women? When we hear that women cut back more, is this positive or negative? What does it mean? On the other hand, as well, we have a lot more women working in so-called system-relevant professions. But there, the wages are usually far lower than in other industries. So the chance of home office is there, but it's also a risk. But maybe we can turn it around because the workflows become also more agile. So the hierarchies become flatter, which means we can use something out of it, not only for women, but also for men. And there, I think we have to look a little bit deeper, because when we look at the survey that was made in Switzerland, far more women actually said that their working environment actually worsened after the pandemic crisis in March. And ever so, goes on a lower level, especially in the healthcare workers there. They think that they have a huge impact in that survey. But also in Germany, we see that the happiness factor in terms of how happy are you with your life, especially of mothers, decreased dramatically. And so we want to look into a few topics here why this could be the case. So, for instance, especially in countries where social security is bad or worse, usually women lose their jobs more often, and you see it here. But they also have earned less from the beginning, So there was a disparity in inequality from the start. So it was at a totally different level where we started off. Especially single women are particularly hard hit. For instance, in the US, about a third of them are women. And again, they usually, work in jobs where home office is not possible at all. They had to quit their jobs to take care of their families. And also in Switzerland, in 2018, we had around 170,000 single parent homes, and 83% of them actually were women. And so you can also see here that even in Switzerland, we have to be careful that we do not always talk about like this stereotypical conservative family, you know, where we have one father, one mother, and two kids, and maybe not a dog. But we also have to include other models of families. We have to include, you know, different situations in our country. And I think that is very important. And also what we see here, although I said I want to focus on gender here, but I thought this chart is very interesting because we also see that other aspects of diversity together with gender has a far bigger effect on the women's unemployment rates. So I think that is something that we have to keep in mind. And going forward, I also want to show you here another chart. For instance, the ones that on the left, we see that actually women keep our society going in a crisis because, as I said, they usually work far often in industries which are system relevant. You know, without them, our society could not sustain. So it's always thought that women are actually looking far more for home office, but that's actually not true. Mostly it's men that do jobs that can be done in home offices. So this is, you know, due to the fact of the horizontal work segregation. So when we talk about home office, we also have to keep this chart in mind. And then also, for instance, when we see the wages on the right, obviously, whenever there's something that is technological, IT, engineer, something like that of the STEM area, the wages are usually higher. But when we go into the industries where we have more women, there the salaries drop dramatically. And again, there we see that this probably will not change very fast, even though during the lockdown, everybody was clapping for the healthcare workers. But clapping alone does not help, right? I mean, we also have to look at the systemic error here and try to find a way. So also this can be a chance that women are not, again, being sidelined at work from an economical perspective. So this brings me actually to a summary of what we talked about here and what are the roles and responsibilities, especially for our leaders. Because a crisis can actually also shake the encrusted structures and cultures in organizations. So they are changeable, but something like a crisis can actually kind of kickstart that. And one of the things that is very important is, as a leader, I'm responsible to look very closely in each individual situation. So when we talk about home office, we have to talk to each individual situation. What does that mean? You know, is it the single mother? Is it the single father? How can we divide the work? How can we support, for instance, with the policy that care working is considered working hours? So those are all topics that are lie in the responsibility of leaders. On the other hand, as I said, we have to check the promotion practices, the processes in our companies. Does it mean that, because I am a mother and I have to take care of children, I'm not as ambitious? Or is it, again, the bias that I have to prove it all over again, especially during a time now in crisis where maybe I had to look for my family more often? Will I be punished because of that? And again, there, the leaders have to look into that very closely. Because also men actually demand more flexible models, and that's good. And I hope that they will not be punished either. So here, what is also important when we have a crisis, we can also use it as an opportunity as a leader to act more in a participatory style. For instance, when we have virtual meetings, it's very important that we include everybody. And it can just make us aware what inclusive leadership means. So here I see a huge opportunity to act more inclusively in the leadership role, and not just think because we all sit at the same table, everybody is included. We have to do that more when we act and interact virtually. We have to address inequality openly as a leader, because diversity and inclusion is not just nice. It's really an essential topic nowadays. And, it has cross-cutting impacts. It's a social issue. And I'm always a bit negatively surprised, especially since March, when I hear from companies, oh no, right now we don't have time for diversity. We are in a crisis. And then I'm like, that is on one hand, totally discriminating, but on the other hand, also a bit stupid, because would any organization ever say they don't have time for business development or marketing or finance? And diversity is as important. So you see that the mindset that they have comes to the surface, and they think diversity is just nice to have, but in crisis, we cannot afford it. But exactly in crisis, we need it, because we need different perspectives to change, the gear, to move a sustainable development. And therefore, everybody who tells me that they don't have time for diversity, I definitely need to have a talk, and I address it quite openly. And sometimes it helps, and sometimes it takes a little bit more time. And obviously, this will help us to emerge stronger from this crisis. And on the other hand, I mentioned in the beginning, I also think that we as women have to take advantage, actually, of this current change. And it's also our responsibility to approach our problems, for the long term. And we cannot just hold the position and do not ask for more. So we cannot allow ourselves to be pushed back at home and in the companies. We have to use the opportunity for partnership-based division of labor at home. Also, we have to claim and invest in our future, in executive education, in our personal development, because there will be a time after the crisis, and then we can actually be visible and take on more responsibility. So I feel that the responsibility lies on both sides, and I hope that we can take something out of it. And I would love to wrap up and conclude with this statement from Klaus Schwab. And obviously I highlighted the word that sticks out, and it's about equality. And I do think that inequalities are coming to the surface more in such a crisis, not only between men and women, but also between rich and poor, between different age groups, among minorities. But again, this is not just a nice thing to do. It has a social relevance, and it is very important that we address that. And I feel that gender diversity and gender equality is more and more important, especially coming out of a crisis.
I guess originally we started kind of linking the two presentations of today, assuming that there would be quite a lot of gender differences in our survey results, but they're not really. But I will come to that. And then I thought, well, maybe it's a moment also, and I listened into the previous talk a little bit. I think it picks up nicely from the end there in terms of what are actually work practices that we should look out for, especially since we're into kind of the long haul now. I guess when we did the survey originally, we thought, okay, we learn, and then we will have this new normal that everybody talked about. But I think there's no new normal in sight, and therefore, I mean, we just need to keep going as much as we can with trying to try out new things and not get bogged down by this just whatever going on and on. So that's the overall aim of this talk. I think from, yes, my background work in organizational psychology, I mean, remote work has been a topic for a long time, ever since people were able to work from home. I mean, that goes back to, I mean, textile workers in 1900, right? I mean, they worked from home, many women actually, which was usually a pretty desperate situation. I mean, they would just have ill-paid jobs from home. And then people in the 80s were afraid that with the new teleworking possibilities through technology, that women now would actually be sent back home again. And there's a wonderful little video clip by Ruth Dreifuss in 85, where she talks about, still then the head of the Swiss Union Association, where she talks about the dangers of remote work for women, especially, how they would again be kind of locked away home again, and how that really we needed to all, I mean, watch out for that kind of danger and possibility. Then I guess eventually, I mean, people found remote work is a good idea because it gives more flexibility for men and for women. And then many studies over the years found that people would like to actually work more from home than usually companies allow them to, with issues around trust. I mean, do these people really work when they're at home? With also all sort of legal and insurance questions. Am I insured when I work from home as much as when I'm in the company? How do I check the time worked at home, etc., etc.? And now we had this COVID situation, the first round, and everybody, was to find actually remote work works, and many people that were very doubtful about it before thought, it's not so bad after all. And a lot of confirmation of what we know already, that it allows us for self-determined work schedules, shorter, more efficient meetings, no commuting and traveling, and usually people reporting that they were more productive. And I put a little kind of in the background here, this screenshot from a World Economic Forum meeting, where again, I mean, many companies reported those kinds of results, and I put the WEF here in particular because to me, the WEF is an interesting organization. They did not allow remote work before the lockdown. Then, as everybody else, they had to go completely remote. And it was actually the first Zoom conference I ever attended was end of February when the WEF decided that a meeting that was supposed to take place in San Francisco with, I don't know, 100 people or so, was just moved to Zoom, and it worked. And we were all amazed how well it worked. But there is kind of double-edged sword parts of this story also. I mean, we all know the blurring boundaries between work and other life domains. And I guess in the previous talk, quite a lot was around that also. And that is maybe more an issue for women than for men, based on whatever division of labor had been there before, that might even now be exacerbated in this situation. We've also found that Zoom meetings like this one are kind of efficient, but are they really effective? I guess that's still up to decide. I mean, we know, as I put here again, a little screenshot, I mean, the people that kind of look like they're there, are they really there? The students that we lecture, I mean, when you then send them to breakout sessions, you find that these people aren't around. I mean, they just left the computer on, and who knows where they are. So there's gains and losses there. And probably the most fundamental thing from, again, it's from a psychological perspective, is questions of trust and control. If people work from home, work more independently, work with simply less connection, maybe eventually also less identification with the organization they work for. I mean, sitting at home, how much do I still feel that I'm an employee of the ETH, or am I just Gudela Grote sitting at home and talking to you? And that might change how I talk and what I do. So with this kind of as background, a few findings from our study. And I start off with the gender differences because that was kind of the whole reason for giving this talk originally. So as Caitlin mentioned already, we originally sent out an invitation to be part of this survey to all and everyone who's employed at ETH. And then over the 10 weeks, on average, about 1,700 people responded. And it was actually amazingly all the way those 10 weeks, pretty much 50-50 men and women that answered. And it was pretty much 50-50 scientific staff on the one hand, administrative and technical staff on the other. And 23% were people with leadership function, pretty much, again, pretty constant through the 10 weeks. Now the gender differences. We actually didn't find many. There were kind of slight tendencies for some questions, and I put those up here. So women experience slightly more negative emotions and social isolation. That was kind of in terms of general well-being. The one finding, there were no kind of differences around performance, around collaboration. That was all seemed pretty much the same situation on average, regardless of gender. What we did find, which we thought was interesting, was at the very last survey, we asked, assuming that, yes, this new normal was around the corner, how would people want to work in the future in terms of how many days at home versus at their organization? And that's the answers we got from males and females, where you can see kind of the preferred overall kind of most frequent value was 2 days for men, and almost equally 2 days and just 1 day for women. So always this general assumption, women are the ones that want to work more from home because they have all this wonderful flexibility there. Doesn't really show up in our data, rather the reverse. We then looked more closely into, can we find any differences between the men, the women that said 1 versus 2 days, and we didn't really find anything. I mean, we had kind of the hypothesis it might be women with more kind of family care responsibilities that wanted to kind of evade having to care for their family all the time. So they might vote for the 1 day rather than 2, for instance, but we didn't find any of that. So whatever it means, it seems the general prejudice that women love to work from home, maybe not. And then we also asked whether, given this trust and control issue, whether people felt that they would be allowed to work from home according to their preferences, whether they felt their supervisors trusted them when they worked from home, and in a supervisory role, would people express trust towards their direct reports. And what we found was women were slightly less optimistic than men that they would be allowed to work according to their preferences, and maybe to some extent an astonishing finding, women in their role as supervisors expressed less trust in their direct reports that they would do proper work from home compared to men. So again, whatever that means, we can't really dig deeper into that finding, but maybe women aren't these super wonderful leaders after all. Maybe they're just simply more realistic than men. I don't know. Anyway, so much for gender differences. Moving along with a few other findings around those kind of issues of work-home boundary, virtual collaboration, and trust and control. You find here always kind of the 10 weeks averages for 4 groups of employees within ETH: administrative staff, technical staff, doctoral students, postdocs, and then professors and senior scientists. What you find, really looking at all of it together, it remained pretty stable for those 10 weeks on all of these different questions. We had slight kind of movements maybe around social isolation, that it looked like people were able to cope with that a little better after the 10 weeks. this other question of do I have to be available more than before outside of regular work hours? That was kind of a fairly strong expression at the start, and that seemed to also taper off a little bit. So the overall picture, I guess, which we then fed back also to ETH, is overall it seems like we all did reasonably well for those 10 weeks. Whether we can keep this up for now, probably much longer than 10 weeks, and given that there's kind of not really a silver lining, even when all of this will go back to something that one might call a desired state of affairs, we don't know, and therefore we're currently discussing with the ETH Schulleitung to actually restart this survey, but maybe not do it as often, maybe do it once a month, because this might actually be the much more difficult stretch than the last time around. So last point again, maybe about this trust and control here. As I mentioned, we asked, do I feel trusted? And then do I trust? And you see that people actually in general feel trusted, and you could even say maybe a bit too much, because then when you ask the supervisors, they are also fairly optimistic and trusting, but not quite as much. What I lastly want to point out, and I think that also goes back to the previous talk, I think the bit that I heard, there's lots and lots of individual differences that one shouldn't forget when one looks at these average values. And I just put a few quotes from our survey up here, where, I mean, you have kind of the negative statements around staying alone in a one-room apartment without personal contact. I mean, you know what that probably feels like. A quote I really liked, I mean, a sad one of the professors I worked with was more concerned about the well-being of the plants in his office than about my well-being. But then there were positive ones also. Higher demands are placed on personal responsibility, which has motivating effects for me, or extremely high understanding by colleagues, supervisor for the difficult situation between home office and homeschooling. So then one question obviously is what makes up these differences? It's not really around gender, as I said. What is it then? And we looked at a few kind of general kind of variables that could be of interest there. One thing, I mean, given that this is new and to some extent maybe it was exciting, I mean, how much was it a learning opportunity? We did ask people at the very start about their so-called learning goal orientation. And we did find, as one would predict, that people that had high learning goal orientation, they generally took the situation more positively in terms of their emotions, work engagement, performance, and they talked less about conflicts. Then obviously another quite obvious kind of thing to look at is, do I in general like to work in a team? And there are clearly people that says, yes, I love to work with others. They had a harder time during those 10 weeks in terms of stress, less positive emotions, in their own assessment, less performance and more social isolation. They did say that communication went better for them. So maybe whatever perspective taking and all that, working with teams, maybe that helped them to communicate well in their own view, always, obviously. And this is something I guess we all push to work in teams, to like to work in teams. So, and now we've created that preference and we have to deal with it now. And that's something we need to look at quite closely. Okay, is there any way to compensate for that when we sort of virtually can work in teams, but not really, I think, in many cases. And then we looked at two kind of job design factors where one can do something more directly about, which is job autonomy. And as we know, in general, job autonomy is a good thing. And it also has been a good thing working through this crisis. Again, people said they were more engaged, less stress, better performance, less conflict, less social isolation. The last point is interdependent tasks. The more interdependent tasks you have, therefore, there's a need to actually deal with others, contact others, be involved with others. That was a good thing again. And I guess that helps also for people that like to work in teams, that they definitely should work on interdependent tasks more to counterbalance this virtual situation. Downside, maybe one can, I put plus and minus here for interdependent tasks, is people that work in these more interdependent tasks, they also said that their boundaries between work and private life blurred more. And that can be, if I don't mind that or even like that, it's a good thing. If I rather want to segment, it's not such a good thing. And what we did find over the 10 weeks, that most people started to segment more. So they tried to create more separate parts of their lives again. What could be ingredients then for flexible working overall, and to make us work through this in a situation where we have to, and obviously also hopefully in a future where we get the choice to. And the first point is really, I mean, it's about work motivation, and it's about designing good jobs that will help productivity, will help well-being, rather than, I mean, supervisors feeling they need to control their people, they need to call on them or whatever to find out whether they're really working, etc. To avoid social isolation, key is, again, a job design issue, is to create more interdependent tasks in teams that can be in the direct work people do, but it could also be through maybe extra projects. I just talked to my secretary, for instance, whose work is a lot. I mean, just plowing through stuff on her own, and she just loves if she gets kind of a project where she can then interact more with the team as a way to break out the monotony of all the other financial and personnel stuff or whatever that she has to do. Third point, as much as we can, try to really look at what's the requirements of communication with people, and what channel is the most appropriate one. I mean, for the moment, we tend to do everything by Zoom. As soon as you start talking to somebody, oh, we need to talk, then, okay, I'll set up a Zoom meeting. But maybe actually we could talk on the phone. Maybe email would work in this situation. I guess nobody writes letters anymore, but whatever. I mean, just really think about what's actually the richness of communication that we usually have. And now everything seems to be channeled into having a Zoom, a team, or a WebEx or whatever meeting. And that is really just one way, and there's other ways. And maybe that enriches our lives again, also, if we just look at these other means of communication. And then, yes, of course, I mean, we know from long research on virtual communication and collaboration that it works, but it needs to be balanced with face-to-face interactions. And so whatever small opportunities we might have for face-to-face interactions, to use them. Maybe also, I mean, I think Zoom, for instance, works on a more personal, more informal level, much easier when you're just on a one-to-one kind of conversation, where you can keep a more informal way of talking. And maybe if we can't have face-to-face interactions, then maybe at least not just think, okay, we had the team meeting so everybody could talk, but maybe really just all talk to people individually in this more than informal way that is even possible in a virtual conversation. And as has been a long standing issue, I mean, we've been talking about the demands of any time, any place working for so long, and this is even more the case now. We need a code of conduct how we manage those demands. And that can be, I mean, the old issue of, can I write emails and expect responses on the weekend? Do I have to be up late for what to just be sure that if somebody wants to call and or whatever, to be available? As I mentioned, people felt that they were pushed to make themselves more available in the spring from the survey responses. And that's something, and it seemed like it worked over the 10 weeks a bit better, but maybe one can formalize this to some extent also. And I think lastly, to me, an interesting issue is what happens to organizational identity when we work all over the place. Russell, for instance, I mean, doesn't have a picture of himself, but of DFAB, so we know what he identifies with. Hello. Others, I mean, might have just their whatever personal pictures. yes, do I use the virtual backgrounds that say ETH or whatever on it, or am I like me here just in my room at home? It makes a difference. And it makes a difference in our attitude, how we talk, how we behave, in which role we are. So the longer, I guess, we live without the physical symbols of where we belong, maybe we have to make up new symbols and even have a stupid ETH virtual background behind or whatever that maybe can help. Last one, I mean, what could be possible routes for these new hybrid work practices? Currently, they're not so hybrid, but maybe eventually they will be hybrid. And following up on what was said earlier, I think it's very much about an open and inclusive dialogue, really, at all levels of the organizations you're at. And I mean, dare to speak up if you feel that you're, I don't know, because you're a woman, because you have kids at home, somehow have been pushed out. I mean, we had some responses from our survey, which really sounded dire in terms of, I mean, women saying, I'm not even included in emails anymore. I mean, people behave as if I don't exist anymore and I have no way of getting myself involved again. So, I mean, if anyone experiences that situation or even just kind of is worried about it, I mean, really try and speak about it. I mean, be it to managers, but also be it among peers. Maybe it's a perception that other people share, and something can be done about it. And I think it's, I mean, we're all so tired about talking about Corona. I mean, take this as an opportunity to discuss more generally what are positive and negative experiences at work and what can be done about them. Because, I mean, there is a little bit of experimental spirit simply because there has to be, and that can be an opportunity also to maybe change things that are not really Corona related in any way, but might be something that bugged you always, and now is the moment to get a push for it. And along with that, I guess, I mean, as much as we can to try and emphasize curiosity, creativity, and learning, and not perfect solutions. I mean, we try, and I guess with students now, they might get more impatient because, I mean, they feel like now this woman has experimented with Zoom for half a year and she still can't share her screen, right? But hopefully, there's an understanding that we're still all learning and there's no perfect solutions. And whenever, I mean, listening to good practice examples, I mean, if we have any chance at all for whatever, a few comments or questions, I'd be very curious to hear of good examples, because I mean, we can all just get little moments, little ideas. I mean, just before this meeting here, I had a meeting with the president and the rector of the ETH, where we talked around among other things, the situations of students at the ETH, which are pretty terrible. And it seems like there's quite a lot of anxiety, depression even around students. So what can we do? I mean, what little sparks can we produce? So maybe anybody at ETH, whatever, you will see what if we can come up with anything. Again, any suggestions are very, very welcome on this. In terms of maybe more general organizational perspective to finish off here, I think leaders need more sensing mechanisms for the well-being and performance in their teams. And how can this be done if you can't just kind of whatever walk along the corridor and look into people's offices? What's kind of the more informal ways of doing that? Because if you schedule formal meetings all the time, then your people might feel more that you want to control them rather than you want to hear about how they're doing. So I think we all need ideas for this, how this can be done. And along with that, I guess, how can we balance formal and informal communication? And we can have the virtual coffee breaks and whatever, but as long as we all kind of stare at each other on the screen as a group, I mean, this does not compare to, I mean, having a small chat for 2 minutes with this person and then for 3 minutes with another person. I mean, I don't know. Is there technical solutions that can help us? I mean, can we have kind of random breakout sessions for 10 minutes of coffee break to create this mix of, I don't know, any idea is very welcome, but I think that's one of the core issues we need to handle better than we currently do. And then obviously very practical things. I mean, there are still new people coming into our organizations. How can we help them on board when we can't really meet them? I can't give them a feel for the place. And also performance assessment. I mean, that is coming up for many organizations that are in these annual cycles. I mean, are people really aware how much more difficult it will be to assess performance, or do they find ways to make it easier, use different kinds of indicators, and generally, hopefully, just be more gentle to each other in this, given that we all don't know. So that's it. Thank you very much.